This Christmas, we'll see sales of luxury cars and private jets and super yachts hit an all-time high. Yet food banks in my constituency are now running out of food. We've got homelessness at record levels, and last year 4 million people experienced destitution. Just tell us, do you ever lie awake at night worrying about the level of economic inequality in our country?
No, I want to make sure that we can reduce economic inequality and spread opportunity, and I'm pleased that we are making progress on that. So here are the facts. Income inequality is lower today than it was in 2010. The number of people living in absolute poverty is lower, 1.7 million fewer people, and the number of people in low-paid work is at the lowest on record.
But you also know that wealth inequality is up.
Okay.
There are now 300,000 more children living in poverty. And if you take a step back, the top 1% in our country have multiplied their wealth by 31 times more than the wealth of everybody else. That doesn't sound like an economy that's working for everybody.
Again, as I just said, there are 1.7 million fewer people living in absolute poverty today than there were in 2010. That includes hundreds of thousands of children. And when it comes to the progressivity of our tax system, again, it's more progressive today than it was in 2010, where the top 5% of taxpayers pay around half of all income tax from memory. So the tax system has become more progressive, so the most wealthy are bearing a bigger burden, and we are reducing inequality, reducing poverty because of the actions of this government.
So why do we have the worst inequality of any major European economy?
All I can tell you is I don't have the international comparisons, but I can tell you from the level that we inherited from the last Labour government, we have reduced income inequality, and that's a record that I'm proud of.
I'm interested. Do you consider yourself a leader on the global stage?
I think others will make that determination. I'm very proud of the UK's leadership in multiple areas over the past 12 months. Ukraine being an obvious example. We were the leader to provide main battle tanks to Ukraine, first country to do that.
I'm interested in you.
Well, I stand here. Well, these are things that I have done on behalf of the UK. So again, at the end of the day, these are things we do as a country, as a government. But ultimately, I'm the one that takes the decisions. So we were the first country to provide main battle tanks, first country to provide long-range weapons, first country to provide training for combat air pilots. All of those have now been copied by other countries, rightly so, and we were the first country to call for multilateral long-term security assurances.
Let me ask you...
and that's just in the Ukraine space.
Well, that's just in defence space, and I want to talk to you about development and humanitarian.
I was just about to get onto that, so...
If I could ask my question.
Great.
Yemen is in the news again. What's not being commented on yet is since 2015, Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Despite this, you made successive cuts to their aid as Chancellor. And this year you cut UK aid to Yemen to a third of what it was in 2019-20. As penholder of the UN Security Council and a country in such desperate need, do you now regret those cuts that you made?
No. So when it comes to the aid budget...
Sorry, your first answer was no, you don't.
I don't regret the cuts to the overall aid budget, the decision I made as Chancellor that was actually approved by the House of Commons in a vote. Now, I appreciate the Labour Party opposed it. I guess the question for them is, and for everyone that opposed it, in fact, is where would they have £5 billion from?
The question, Prime Minister, with respect, is do you regret that, cutting aid to one of the worst humanitarian crises on the planet?
Yeah, so what I think is the right thing for the UK, given the fiscal situation that we face in recovering from the pandemic, that we reduced our aid budget from 0.7 to 0.5. I think that was the right thing to do. We remain, it's an important point, you asked about leadership, we remain one of the largest aid spenders anywhere in the world, both as an absolute amount, and we'll spend around £12 billion this year, but also as a percentage of GDP out of large economies. We are one of the largest contributors to individual funds, whether that's the Global Fund or indeed the Green Climate Fund. So across the board.
I think this is the answer you gave to me 6 months ago in my last
and the facts remain the same, they haven't changed.
Yeah, but I'm interested in your position on things. So do you see a correlation between what's happening in the Red Sea now and the fact that the UK and indeed the international community has turned its back on Yemen for a very long time?
No, I don't think that's right. And I don't think when I talk to my international peers about this situation as we're actively doing, not a single one of them has made that point.
Okay.
And we're actively involved right now, particularly with the US, but a much broader coalition in standing up an operation to provide deterrence and protect our open seas. That is an incredibly important thing for the UK to be doing, given it's something that we've always believed in. This is not about actually the situation in Israel and Gaza. This is about malign forces, and the Houthis in particular, taking advantage of the situation to try and escalate.
Thank you.
And that is having a real impact on the global economy, and we are playing our part as part of a broader international coalition.
Can I move you on to something?
But I think it's important on this point. So what we are doing...
You're not answering my point.
I think
you're giving me a policy answer to something else. Could I turn
No,
to
but I think it is important because
Prime
it's not
Minister.
just aid that will help the situation, it's also military deterrence.
And leadership.
And again, we were the first country after the US to send assets into the region.
Well, Biden has said that there were indiscriminate bombings taking place. Do you agree?
As I've been very clear, too many innocent civilians have died, and
So
we've
therefore
been very...
you agree that the targeting is indiscriminate, therefore if too many civilians have died?
I'm not privy to the precise targeting, but what I can say is clear that too many innocent people have died in this conflict.
But you will have received advice from government lawyers and submissions. Have any of those submissions or any advice you've received from lawyers or anyone within number 10 suggested that international humanitarian law is being broken?
No, again, the government never comments on the legal advice it receives. Now, what is absolutely clear, I've been consistent throughout this from day one, we can't forget what happened. Right? Hamas perpetrated an appalling terror attack on Israel. Innocent people were slaughtered. And Israel has every right to defend itself, to ensure its security, make sure that nothing like that ever happens again to its citizens. We would do exactly the same.
But there
if
are
it was
also
us.
limits under international law.
And of course
to
there
the
are,
right
and
to
I've made
self-defense.
that point from the beginning, and we've consistently called on Israel to do that.
So
and
forgive
that
me
is
though.
what we will always do.
But forgive me, Prime Minister,
alongside
your current Foreign Secretary, when he was Prime Minister, was quite happy to state when he felt that international humanitarian law was being broken in Syria. Equally, James Cleverly's Foreign Secretary was happy to say that war crimes are taking place in Ukraine. So surely there is a precedent that you are able to say, if you believe that too many civilians are dying, that bombings have been indiscriminate and therefore that the principles of necessity and proportionality are not being upheld.
You're putting words in my mouth. Others may have said that.
No, your exact words were too many civilians are dying. You've just repeated it here as well.
Yes, and now too many civilians are dying. Of course, too many civilians are dying. That is different from saying humanitarian law has been broken.
So
every civilian, quite
where is the
frankly,
responsibility for too many civilians dying?
every civilian dying is a tragedy.
But where does the
civilian dying
responsibility
is a
sit for that
tragedy.
decision making?
Sorry?
Where does the responsibility sit for too many civilians dying?
Well, again, ask Hamas why they embed themselves in
forgive
civilian
me, Prime
populations.
Minister, but when we...
I think that's genuinely an extraordinary question. Responsibility for civilians dying. There's two sides to this. Israel is trying to defend itself. If the terrorist organisation which is perpetrating these attacks is deliberately embedding itself inside civilian populations, then they have to accept responsibility for that.
But Prime Minister,
I think Israel is rightly should take every precaution to avoid harming civilians, but that will be very difficult if the precise organisation which has caused untold suffering to the Israeli people is hiding amongst civilians, knowingly doing so, knowingly putting them in harm's way. And it's important not to forget that that is what is going on here.
Very brief final question.
Yes, Prime Minister, nobody's forgotten the crimes against humanity that took place in Israel. There's no more equivalence between the two of them. However, whether it was Northern Ireland, where the UK police had to show restraint and ensure that civilians were not, loss of life was not out of line, disproportionate with the military objectives. When fighting Daesh as well, Daesh did the exact same tactics as Hamas, and yet we did not see this level of casualty. So therefore, will you do more to achieve actual restraint in some of the actions that are taking place on the ground?
We have repeatedly and will repeatedly call on Israel to show restraint, to operate within international humanitarian law, to take every possible precaution to avoid harming civilians, and crucially to allow far more aid to get into Gaza to actually help people. And that is what we are doing, and it is showing that it is working. As I said, the opening of Kerem Shalom is meaningful. We're also exploring alternative maritime corridors, which we've been clear, given our assets in Cyprus, we can play a leading role in. So we are working every which way to get more aid to the people who need it. We've already tripled our aid into the region, and we continue to have dialogue with all our partners about the future of Gaza post this conflict, and that involves my conversations with the Palestinian Authority and others to make sure that we can provide a future for the Palestinian people where they can live with dignity, prosperity and security. That is something that we are completely committed to and will continue to work very hard to bring about.
Thank you, Chair.
I want to ask you about 3 areas where you've made pledges or promises, and I'm going to ask short questions, so I'd very much appreciate short answers. The first one is around the legacy backlog in the Home Office, and you promised that that would be cleared by the end of this year, 92,000 cases. Will you have achieved that?
Well, we're not at the end of the year yet, so the final statistics have not been published, but we are making very good progress. I think the last published numbers show that the backlog is down by 80% from 92,000 down to 18,000, and that has partly come about because we've doubled the number of case workers.
Yes, we know that, Prime Minister. I just want to know whether you think you're going to meet the target that you've set yourself.
I said those are the latest figures. We'll continue to push through it. There will always be, obviously, as there always are, and you know this.
You don't sound very sure, Prime Minister.
Oh, well, we're doing absolutely everything we can. We set an ambitious target. I think when I was here, you were sceptical that we would get anywhere close to it, but it's already down by 80%.
80%, but you did say by the end of the year, and that's just a few days. Can I ask you then, what about the other 91,000 that's sitting there in the other backlog? When do you think that will be cleared?
Well, with the overall asylum backlog, I think at the same time as the 92 was about 131,000. That is down by 16%. Now, obviously, that's impacted by
when do you think it will be cleared, Prime Minister?
I don't have a.
You don't have an idea when that will be cleared. The 91,000.
I know we haven't set a target for that publicly, but obviously, once the priority was clearing the initial legacy asylum backlog.
But you're not sure you'll do that.
Okay. Your words, not mine. We remain on track to do it, but we're not at the end of the year.
Right. Well, I'm keen that I move on to my second question to you, which is about the pledge you made to stop the boats. So when will you have stopped the boats?
What's
the date for that?
Well, the first thing to say is we have made progress, and that is that the numbers this year are down by a third, which is considerable progress.
They're still the second highest on record, though, aren't they, this year?
They are, for the first ever time, down.
They're still the second highest, but what is the date?
There isn't a firm date on this because I've always been clear from the beginning.
You said you're going to stop the boat, so I just want to know
and
what the date is.
And we will keep going until we do.
Okay.
This is not one of these things where there's a precise date estimate on it.
You don't have a date?
This is something where before I took this job, they had only ever gone up.
Okay.
And now they're down by a third. And an important part of finishing the job is having a deterrent for everybody.
Well, can I come on to that? Because that's the Rwanda policy. So you've said that you want to see planes take off by the spring to Rwanda. That's one of the things you've said. Now, I understand that no airline is willing to actually contract with government to remove people to Rwanda because of reputational damage. Is that correct? There isn't an airline that you've got lined up to remove people?
I think we are, in terms of timing, I'd say I want to get flights off as soon as practically possible.
You need some planes to do that.
We do, but we also need to be able to pass the legislation through Parliament first.
Right, but on the plane point, which I'm asking you specifically about, do you have an airline that's ready to go?
I'm confident we will have the ability to send people to Rwanda.
But you
there
don't
are
have
many
an airline.
steps. You wouldn't expect me to comment on commercial conversations that are necessarily private, but I'm highly confident that we can operationalise the bill in all its aspects.
Okay.
That's not just about flights. There's many different steps that you need. But the legislation needs to get through Parliament first.
Okay, so we're not
and
clear...
as quickly as it passes, then we will work to operationalise the bill.
Any airlines. Okay. The Migration and Economic Development Plan, which you signed up to when you were Chancellor, I think, with the then Home Secretary, we know that 290 million now has been spent or is about to be spent in the next few months. Could you just tell the Liaison Committee how much the total amount that you signed up to for that 5-year plan? How much else, what's the amount that we've got to pay in addition to the 290?
I think you know full well, because the Home Secretary has said this in Parliament multiple times before. We disclose these things on an annual basis, and beyond that, we've disclosed the most recent number.
How many people is this government returning?
This government last year returned about just over 20,000 people in various different ways.
Okay, so a little less than one every 8 minutes. We're going to do the maths on that. But you talked about disclosing the cost of the Rwanda project, Prime Minister, and you have repeated the line that it must be disclosed on an annual basis. It is perfectly normal and within the normal accounting rules in terms of reporting to the Public Accounts Committee and the departmental committees, in this case the Home Affairs Select Committee, to report on projects on a different basis, especially something that's a flagship. This is a flagship policy of yours, Prime Minister. So producing information in the annual accounts, which is 15 months after the last £100 million payment was made to Rwanda, is not acceptable. What is the problem about just being open and honest about something you signed off as Chancellor that you're now championing as Prime Minister that's a 5-year programme? What's the secrecy?
Because, as we've been very clear, it may well be that we want to have other conversations with other countries.
Okay, which other countries are you thinking of having a conversation with?
But again, it wouldn't be right to talk about these things if we're having private conversations with countries about potential alternatives to add to our Rwanda policy. We've always been clear that that is something that the government would like to
Prime Minister,
explore.
I've been on the Public Accounts Committee now for 12 years, and I'm aware of lots of things that are talked about as being commercially confidential. And then when we ask to see the papers, they're not at all. I cannot see, nor can other members of my committee, what is commercially confidential about this that won't be commercially confidential when the accounts are produced. There isn't an arbitrary timeline when something stops being commercially confidential and then does. And is no longer confidential. There is no reason to have a 15-month delay between payments being made. The only reason this money was revealed was because somebody in Rwanda, possibly inadvertently, we don't know, there's an inquiry going on, and released it to the International Monetary Fund, which itself is instructive, is it not?
I think we probably just have a different point of view on this. I think
No, Prime Minister, can I be clear? I chair the Public Accounts Committee, a constitutional committee of over 160 years standing, cross-party with 5 parties on it. I'm not playing a party political point. This is a public accounting point. You have been a renowned Chancellor of this Exchequer, took us through COVID. I think you understand those rules very clearly. So can we just be really clear? Why are you not sharing with Parliament and the public the money being spent on the Rwanda scheme? It's a 5-year project. You signed it off as Chancellor. You must have been content then, despite you now having to pass legislation to operationalisation it. Why did you not think about asking those questions then? You must have been asking those questions. Why can't you share that money with the money with us?
Again, there's a balance to be struck. There is annual transparency of these numbers to Parliament. I think that strikes
Prime
the right
Minister,
balance.
it is not the normal transparency, Prime Minister, that is provided on other big projects, like, for example, High Speed 2, Take 1. I could give you many other examples. We were receiving 6 monthly reports laid to Parliament. That is the normal approach, and it is normal to negotiate this with the Public Accounts Committee on a routine basis. We do that regularly with other departments. It's a flagship policy of yours. What is there to hide? There should be nothing to hide.
The scale of HS2 compared to this, obviously, just by order of magnitude, very different. I mean, phase 1
so it's
of
about
HS2
the scale of the project.
Again, all these things will be, there's an appropriate balance. I mean, HS2 was the single biggest project that the government is undertaking. The cost for phase 1, which we'll be aware of, well north of 40
Okay, well, I just make the final observation.
That's very different.
The HS2 6-monthly reporting was because the counting officer agreed with the Public Accounts Committee on a method and frequency of reporting, and that is the normal thing that we often negotiate with departments. So I hope you could give some succour to the Home Office that if they do similar, they will have your full backing. Thank you.
It's not much of a market or market forces you have when companies are being protected by the regulator to put up domestic prices because they say it's unpaid bills, but they're making huge profits. British Gas has reported profits of 969 million for the first 6 months of 2023, 900% up from the same period of 2022. The French state-owned EDF is making an absolute fortune in the UK with profits of about 2 billion. Scottish Power is seeing their profits up as well. E.ON too. Aren't you just giving blank cheques to power companies through the structure of the energy market?
So no, I think it's interesting. The first question is about saying you're walking back, which we're not, from targets on various things, on boilers and cars. And the next question is about the impact on consumer bills. Right? So what we've done
is... The impact on consumer bills is due to allowing the regulator to raise the price for profitable companies. Enhancing profits, Prime Minister. That's what that is. So don't conflate the two.
I'm getting onto that, but I do think the impact on household finance is important, which is why my approach to net zero, and I get that you disagree with this, is one which is pragmatic. Because I care about the impact on family finances. So where there were opportunities to say...
if you do.
Where there are opportunities...
Is this price cap going to rise?
Where there are opportunities to save families £5,000, £10,000, £15,000 by adopting a more pragmatic approach to net zero, keeping us internationally leading, but doing that in a proportionate way, I think that's the right thing to do to ease the cost of living pressures on families. Now, alongside that, I implemented a windfall tax on energy companies that is 75% and we have used the money from that tax, which is one of the highest in the world on energy companies,
you're aware the profits are
to
help
pay around half of a typical family's energy bill over the past year. So that's what we've done. 75% windfall tax on energy companies, use that money to help pay for around half of a typical family's energy bill, and adopted a more pragmatic approach to net zero, which is saving families thousands of pounds.
In the UK,
because I think that's important.
I mean, British workers, according to the Resolution Foundation, are missing out on about 10,700 a year after a decade of weak economic growth, which you're in government for a large part and Chancellor of the Exchequer for a good part. And the living standards gap is about 8,300 between typical households in Britain and their peers in Australia, Canada, France, Germany and the Netherlands. Combined with that, poorer households are about £4,300 worse off than their French and German counterparts. That's a pretty damning indictment of where you've taken the economy, isn't it, Prime Minister? Both as Prime Minister and Chancellor, and you're generally your time in office.
I think what you failed to mention in your setup was the fact that we've
the rest of the points I did mention, because I don't want you to go on another tangent.